IVM.
Welcome to All Things Policy, a daily podcast by the Takshashila Institution. We are a bunch of policy nerds based in Bengaluru, and we like bringing fresh perspectives to Indian affairs and Indian perspectives to global affairs. So grab a cup of coffee, sit back, and join us for today's chat. Hello and welcome to a special episode of All Things Policy. My name is Manoj Keval Ramani, and today I am joined by Mr. Avtar Singh Bhasin. Mr. Bhasin has served in the Ministry of External Affairs for 3 decades, joining in 1963 and then retiring in June 1993 as Director of the Historical Division. He was posted in Indian missions in Kathmandu, Bonn, Vienna, and Lagos during his time at the MEA. What's also noteworthy is that after his retirement, Mr. Bhasin has spent tremendous amount of time meticulously documenting India's foreign relations, and there are these tremendous volumes that he has put together, which I recommend that people can check out. But what we're going to be talking about today is his new book. His new book, Nehru, China and Tibet. It's an incredibly detailed account of India's engagement with China and Tibet, predominantly based in the 1940s up to the 1962 war, but he does also talk about developments before the 1940s, such as the Shimla Convention, which have shaped the relationship between India, China, and Tibet, of course. So firstly, Mr. Bhasin, welcome to the conversation.
Thank you.
My first question to you is a little bit about the book and how you why did you think about writing this book and this specific subject right now? I mean, there's tremendous significance to it today, given what's happening between India and China, and also the fact that we are hearing these conversations about the succession of the Dalai Lama. So I wanted to first talk to you about your choice of subject and also then about how you went about researching this book and the material that you gathered.
Thank you, Manoj, and thank you again for inviting me to this talk. You have put the right question why I wrote this book. You know, I have published already 5 volumes of documents on India-China relations. When I was going through those documents, I found that the history of those years is somewhat different from what we know of it. And when I meticulously started studying, I found that our understanding of the past is totally skewed, and our relation with China will never be put on the right path unless we understand the relations of the early years in the right way and see where we made a mistake or where we were right. So this is the trigger for writing this book. And I find that unless we have the right perspective on the older issues, the new issues cannot be sorted out because they rest on the old understanding of issues. We think all this area has been ours. Well, facts are a little different. So therefore, unless we recognize the fact as they were and why we went out of the way to deny them or try to behedge them, we will never be able to sort out this problem. So that was the trigger for writing this book.
It's really interesting that, there is a lot that is known, but there is a lot that still remains unknown because the archives and materials are still not available to researchers. Despite, like you've written, 70 years have passed, yet there is so much that is still classified that we still don't know. What were the documents that you looked at when you started working on this book?
Yeah, you are right. It is unfortunate that our documents still continue to be under the lock and key of the Ministry of External Affairs. And that's the reason why we are ignorant about our past. Now, when I looked into these documents, these are all Nehru's papers, which were lying with the Nehru Memorial Museum and Library in Delhi. But they were not made accessible to people. In 2014, these papers passed on to the Department of Culture. And I applied to the Department of Culture, Government of India at that time, and I got the permission. So these are highly classified documents, as you would probably have seen from my 5 volumes. And they give you a very good perspective, though not a complete, on the happenings of those days. And they clearly set out that there was some misunderstanding on our part about our own borders, which had led to this whole problem. So that is what I agree with you that there are still some documents which are still not available. But my 5 volumes lift the curtain wide enough to give us a right perspective on the issues of those days.
Increasingly, and I agree with you, it's increasingly becoming apparent as to how things evolved at that point of time. And I must confess, while I was reading through the book, it was an intense struggle in some ways, because you look at Nehru, who is your chief protagonist in the book, although there are many other, there's an entire cast of characters who played sort of this role on this grand stage of history. But when you look at Nehru, you see a man who is, who is visionary, who is prescient, who understands how things are going, yet he harbors this incredible blind spot in his relationship with China. You see a man who has a broader vision for the world, but he does not seem to notice that there is a gaping China-sized hole in that vision. And it leaves you incredibly frustrated also as to how he's dealing and how he goes about dealing with China over the years, and how he sort of recognizes the importance of China's rise and the communist revolution and all of that, yet he does not seem to see how that's going to adversely impact India's interests. Would I be right in summarizing that?
Well, I think you are absolutely right when you say he is a man who had very broad vision. But when it came to China, he was not that broad. He was probably thinking everything in the broader sense of world history. He said in 1952 itself in Parliament that we should not look at our foreign policy, whether how much it is in our interest, how much it helps us, but how far it is able to establish world peace, how it is able to establish goodwill in the world. So he was not worried about the Indian part of it, but the worldwide part of it. He was looking at the broader picture, macro picture, not a micro picture. But since he always thought India and China are very important, they must be friends, in order to seek the friendship of China, he went on compromising his position. Chinese were no friends of India from the day one. Before India recognized China, they called him a lackey of the British and the Americans. They called him all sorts of names. After we recognized China, on the Tibet question, they gave us no room at all. They said, it is our internal problem and you have no business to be there. And the 1914 agreement is absolutely, we are not willing to accept it. And also, your establishment in Tibet are illegal.
Yeah.
He just kept quiet. He did not rebut the Chinese. So his problem was, he was always looking at the macro level so that China is not annoyed, it is kept in a good humor, and he went on making compromise after compromise.
And what's also fascinating throughout the book is that there are certain things that the Indian government at that point of time is doing. One of them is, of course, lobbying for China, but for the PRC at the United Nations. And it's conveying that to the PRC also, that we are doing this out of this sort of good-natured friendship and this sense of morality and the rest of it. And the PRC does not seem to be bothered by it at all. The new sort of PRC does not seem to be bothered by it at all. To me, that gave me a sense of what the Indian government valued as important achievements was very different from what the new Chinese leadership under Mao Zedong was valuing as achievements and accomplishments. Their political priorities were very different from ours, and we seem to be mirroring our perceptions of what constitutes power onto them, whereas their understanding of power was completely different. Would you agree with that?
I would more than agree with you, and there's nothing that I can add to what you've already said.
Okay, fair enough. I want to now get into exactly what our relationship was in the early 1900s, when the KMT sort of comes to power, the Kuomintang is in power in China. Nehru has this sort of really positive view of China, firstly as a civilization and as a society. And at one point of time in the book, you quote him as saying that, they have sort of, they're a bunch of grown-up people in some ways. And he has this very favorable view. Yet in 1939, when he visits the country, he is unable to meet the Communist Party or the leaders of the Communist Party. And there is a desire yet to sort of have that linkage.
Yeah.
How did the Communist Party view India and view sort of the role of India pre-independence and post-independence? Because both of those play a role in Chinese perceptions of India. Could you explain that to us?
You see, the Communist Party, I don't think took much notice of India. We, of course, sent the medical mission and they were grateful for that. But for that, there had been no correspondence with the communists and there had been no interaction with the communist leaders. Nehru had never met them until Zhou Enlai came here in 1954. And there was hardly any correspondence between the two before independence. After independence, of course, there was the ambassador, and through the ambassador we were talking and sending notes, and they were sending notes. But one-to-one talk took place only in 1954 when Zhou Enlai came here on way to back home from Geneva. So our understanding of communist China before and after independence was something which was not very deep, I would say. Even China had, after the war, changed a lot. As my book says, we found even the Comintern China looking at us little benignly, little patronizingly, as if we are small power. We are no power compared to China. And at the Asian Relation Conference, as you would have noticed, there was a lot of problem with Comintern China. They were trying to browbeat us in every step, but Nehru stood his way with the Comintern. Yes, he could stay somewhere, but they gave little space to India also. So China was a totally different country after the war, particularly after the war, because they had now won the war along with their allies. It is the Allies who won the war, but since he was an ally of the Allies, he thought he has also won the war, and he was rubbing shoulders with people. So he saw China as a great country, that old Chinese greatness has returned to China. So that is how the things were developing. With communist China or communist leaders, our understanding, our knowledge of them was very, very little.
It's also interesting that while we didn't know much about them, from very early on, it seems like the Communist Party of China is very clear that it wants to reset the relationship with India, and it does not recognize any of these, or it at least is very uncomfortable with any of these historical inheritances that the Republic of India has following the exit of the British from India and Indian independence. I want you to sort of explain to us exactly, because even previous Chinese governments in 1914 did not recognize the Shimla Convention, and subsequently the Communist Party was, and this comes across throughout the narrative in the book, that the Communist Party of China was very clear in terms of what it was communicating to India more than once. What I mean to ask is that when I read the book, this is what it comes across to me, that the Communist Party of China, once it comes to power, it sees the relationship with India, like with others, as something that must be reset on new terms of reciprocity. It does not acknowledge, and it gradually tries to wean away any historical inheritances that India, the new Republic of India, would have gained from because of its sort of inheriting the sort of legacies of the Raj. And it therefore wanted to sort of unwind those inheritances in Tibet in particular. But in general, it wanted a reciprocal relationship, which was on new footing. And that is something that it tries to do with regard to India. How does it sort of go about this? And what is its view on the 1914 Shimla Convention, which defined the McMahon Line?
You see, reciprocity comes when there is a bilateral issues which we are discussing. We had inherited certain positions in Tibet from the British, and we were trying to preserve those things. Whereas China from the day one was, on the other hand, trying to undo all those, and they wanted to take over China. Our interest was that they should do it peacefully, but not through use of coercion and all that. And then they must accept the autonomy of China. We were all the time stressing on the autonomy of China. No, China was not at all concerned with the autonomy or giving them any special status. China only wanted them to be part of China as it used to be in the past, as was their understanding, and no compromise on that at any given time. They had warned the world leaders, countries also, that this Tibet is part of China, and any country receiving a Tibetan delegation would be doing unfriendly act towards communist China. And India was also told that it is our internal problem, and not once but many, many times, both in Beijing and in Delhi, that it is our internal problem and we will not entertain any intervention on Tibet's behalf with us. So there was no bilateralism involved in these things. There was unilateral sort of position taken by China, and we didn't know how to react. We were all the time trying to say, we have no personal interest in China, we have nothing to do, any territorial interest in China, we only want to maintain the autonomy of China. But China was against the autonomy even. They would give them autonomy as available under their system, not as they had it under the British system, under the British or under the 1914 convention. So there was a lot of gulf between the understanding of India towards communist China and Chinese towards India on the question of Tibet. And that is the real issue.
Yeah, this is really interesting because throughout the book, you show that Indian policy with regard to Tibet from very early on is that, that we are only interested in autonomy. We have no territorial designs. And in terms of also our current inheritances that we have, which is the missions that we have over there and the trading relationship that we have, that's what we would like to retain. But at the same time, at least from what you've written and from the words of Nehru that you've cited through the book, it comes across that he was resigned to the fact that it is inevitable that the Communist Party will subsume Tibet into its system. It is extremely, and there is very little that India can do about it. His own perception of India's capacity to be able to shape events in that part of the world, in Tibet, his view was very, very dim, that we have very little capacity to do this, right?
See, he was willing to accept China taking over Tibet, but he wanted two things: that we should be able to deal with Tibet as we were dealing with as a neighbor, and secondly, the autonomy of Tibet must be respected as we understood or as Tibetan understood, not as Chinese understood. These were two conflicting points. We were all the time assuring China that we have no territorial interest, we have no particular interest for ourselves or for our national, but we want to be able to deal with China as we had been dealing in the past. And even when China had taken over Tibet, he still said, I want to maintain relation with Tibet as we had, as an autonomous state, as an autonomous country. So his all the time emphasis was autonomy of China. That was the real point. He was not able to reconcile that China should compromise Tibet's autonomy while taking it over. This was the basic misunderstanding between the two.
Yeah, that's fascinating. That it's really, to me, at the end of the day, it's a case of not viewing and not investing in the capacity to be able to achieve what your policy objective is. That if your policy objective was to make sure that Tibet maintained a certain kind of autonomy that it had in the past, then what is it that you are bringing on the table apart from your good graces to be able to do that? That is the sort of, to me, that's the sort of hole in what Nehru's policy was, where he didn't seem to invest in the capacity that might be, or even think about it as to what is the capacity that would be needed to be able to achieve this, which is fascinating. I want to move on to, the period of Chinese occupation of Tibet. There is a move in the late 1950s, which again, it's interesting to note that this is happening while, the Korean War is also brewing. So the PLA is essentially getting involved on two different fronts in the East and the West. And that again is something that is instructive for people who look at events today, that it was not risk averse. It felt that there was a time to do this, and it went ahead and sort of imposed its will on Tibet. And then they signed this 17-point agreement. Can you tell us a little bit about what the 17-point agreement meant and what was India's view on that deal?
Well, you see, as for not building the capacity, he was against it. Our army had been first of all split between India and Pakistan. Then after the Kashmir war, it was a lot of demobbing took place. With the result, the army were totally incapacitated. And he was against building up the army for any such purpose. He had decided that there is no question of India aggressively responding to any of the Chinese actions in Tibet. He was prepared to compromise but not willing to take any aggressive position. The army was not there. In the Kashmir war, army had exhausted all its resources. The resources had not been replenished. So army was not in a position to take on the PLA. PLA was still big force. They were able to throw the occupy Tibet, throw the Americans out of Korea. So the Chinese, it was not possible for India to take on China at that time. He understood it, and that was the right thing to do because we would not have been able to take on China at all. The Chinese army was still very strong, despite you might say they were busy there. Why did the Chinese attack Tibet in November 1950? Well, they had waited from February to December for the Skapa mission to come to China and negotiate the new relationship. They were finding that this man was delaying things, and they were getting more and more involved in Tibet, and also there was a bombing by the Americans in Manchuria. So they wanted to end the uncertainty that was facing them in Tibet, because repeatedly our ambassador told government of India that China will like to settle Tibet issue by talks with the Chinese, with the Tibetans, but they will not wait indefinitely. The Tibetans must come. But the Skapa mission was deliberately delaying its departure. They were talking to the Americans, they were talking to the British. The British were not helpful. The Americans promised them help. And Skapa felt that it will be possible to handle China via the Americans, which was not possible because the Americans wanted to involve India. And they said, unless India also agrees, we will not join in the war. Even before that, Secretary of State Acheson had sent message to Ambassador Henderson that talk to Nehru and see, would he like to control the Chinese? Will he like to face the Chinese? If they need any help, we will provide. But when Henderson talked to Nehru, what can America do in such a situation? Because we think Tibet's independence, Tibet's security is dependent on you. So Nehru's reply was, you can help us by doing nothing. So that was the sort of mental attitude of our Prime Minister, which did not help the Tibetans and which did not help anything. The Chinese, after waiting for Skapa to come, decided to end the uncertainty. And he was very upset. The Chinese had attacked. And then, not only that, when Skapa was about to leave, he told them, don't leave. And the Tibetans, at his advice, stopped Skapa from going to China.
Yeah, and you document this very well in the book as to how this mission continued to get delayed, and how also the Chinese perception was that this was India sort of playing a role in the delay of this mission over a period of time, and how that sort of further bred this sense of mistrust on both sides. So in 1951, we have this 17-point agreement, which essentially cements the PRC's role in Tibet. Over the years, then we have an agreement between India and China in 1954. And that agreement, lots of people today remember that from the point of view of Panchshil. But that agreement essentially ignores, India refuses to talk, or at least the Indian delegation goes to Beijing with the idea that we are not going to be talking about borders and frontiers. We are limiting this conversation to, the trade mission and our current position in Tibet. And we have that agreement, and over a period of time, there is really no conversation on the borders while maps are being issued and the tension is building up. Can you bring us down from that to, say, the period when the Dalai Lama leaves China and when he takes asylum in India? Again, India had committed to the request much, much earlier than it actually did take place. So, as you documented in the book, right? And when the Dalai Lama requests to leave China, how does that sort of play a role in the dynamic? And how does Nehru and the Indian government deal with the pressures that come with that?
You are talking 1959?
Yes, I'm talking about 1959 because I understand from the book that we had made this, that we had accepted to a potential asylum offer much earlier. It's just that the Dalai Lama sought asylum in 1959.
Yeah, when we letter came with a special emissary from the Dalai Lama to Nehru for asylum, we immediately agreed.
Yeah.
Because by that time our relations had gone so sore that we thought, let him come. You will kindly recall in 1951, China warned India before the talks in Tibet started in in the Beijing. Chinese knew that the Dalai Lama had sought asylum in India, and we were warned that we will not give asylum to him. And we told Tibet, don't, better he stays there. So he didn't come. In 1959, our relations got so bad that Prime Minister was willing to take all the risk that was involved in that. Because the Chinese were blaming India for all what was happening in Tibet in the Tibetan revolt. They clearly, repeatedly told us that Kalimpong was the epicenter of the revolt in Tibet, and India is totally responsible. They were sent us note on this subject. Chou En-lai, in 1956, he came to Delhi. He spoke to Nehru and said Chinese in Kalimpong were creating a problem, but Nehru played it very light. He said, "Oh, Kalimpong is a nest of spies, and there are more spies in Kalimpong than the residents." So he put Kalimpong in the dock. So therefore, Chinese went on believing that the entire problem of Tibet in Tibet is Kalimpong. So much so, the Russian ambassador also felt likewise. So that was the unfortunate part of our position.
I'm also curious to know that there were lots of differences within the Indian political leadership, and you document some of these in the book. Yet, obviously, Nehru sort of prevails over these differences. When we are seeing the relationship become much more difficult, after the Dalai Lama has left China, has left Tibet and has come to India and sought asylum, after the talks between Chou En-lai and Nehru really failed to reach any consensus, and in fact, they are actually there's a lot of acrimony at the end of those talks also. What was the domestic Indian environment, and how could there have been better debate on that? Because it seems like, yes, there was lots of discourse and there was lots of criticism, there was lots of anger with regard to the PRC's policies in Tibet. Yet there seemed to be little critical debate in India about the policy that we were pursuing.
You see, Indian inner debate was based on total misperceptions. We didn't know the real position, how far China was being difficult and how far they are deserted. On the question of the Dalai Lama, when he came here, well, naturally he was taken as a reverend person, and he was given all the respect and all the attention. And it was more than that. The private organization were fetching him and holding meetings and processions in his favor. And the Chinese didn't like it. Chinese felt they were the government of India behind them. Though India assured them, look, these are private organizations which are doing it, and though we don't like it, but we cannot do anything. And when Dalai Lama had come, he was also told by the Prime Minister and also Minister of Finance, there are note issued also, that this asylum is only cultural, religious, and not political. And he should not make any statement which would embarrass the government of India. But he did make here and there certain statements which were embarrassing, and therefore the ministry again issued a statement that he is responsible for his own statement. We are not responsible. But China will not be assured. In their own system, nobody can do it if the government doesn't want it. But if they didn't understand Indian system, that people can do what they like, government may like it or not like it. These misunderstanding and misperception by the two of each other working as a government and system were also responsible to a large extent in creating bad blood between the two countries.
Let me just add another question to that. So today also we see some of this play out, right? Today we see a lot of criticism in India with regard to Chinese official media's coverage of India from time to time. At the same time, we see a lot of criticism from Chinese diplomats in India about how the Indian media is covering, say, the COVID crisis, the use of the term Wuhan virus, China virus, all of those things. Do you think that there is a sense today on both sides about how each other's system works, which is much better than what it was in the 1950s and 60s? Or is there still a huge gap in our understanding of each other and how each other's systems function?
Well, this is the problem. You see, Chinese think everything in their own way, in their own colors. They refuse to accept that any other system can have a different things about the same thing. So these Tibetans who are settled here, they do carry on some thing or the other, some agitation or the other, particularly on the 10th March of every year, which they think is Tibet Uprising Day, and they demonstrate before the Chinese embassy. So we cannot do nothing. It's a very given thing in India to demonstrate as long as it is peaceful. And people do demonstrate and we do nothing. But Chinese do protest all the time, every time when this demand takes place. So there are various problems of understanding each other's culture, each other's system of government, each other's ways of doing things. And unless Chinese understand clearly that democratic system function in a particular manner and they have to adjust themselves to those systems, they will never understand India's position and these problems will continue.
Indeed. My final question to you is that after the 1962 war, Zhou Enlai reached out to Nehru in a letter asking for a secret meeting. Should Nehru have taken that meeting? And if he had taken that meeting, would it have led to a different understanding and probably a resolution on the border? Or should he have not taken that meeting as he did not?
Well, you see, Nehru was in a different frame of mind after the war. Earlier he was not prepared to compromise and now he became more difficult. He felt giving in to Chinese demand or even the suggestion at this time, unless they go back to the 8th September position, will be surrender. For instance, China proposed that let us have a demilitarized zone so that there is no future problem. Nehru again did not agree. He said agreeing to anything which China suggests will be surrender on his part. So his frame of mind had changed after 62. You would have seen in my book, there was a proposal for him from Zhou Enlai to Nehru to meet together quietly at some place and sort out the matter. Well, you know what he did to that message? He just burnt it and said nothing doing. So he would not compromise anything. Even when the Colombo powers made certain proposals, they were the starting points. They were not the award given by the arbitrators, so which everybody had to accept before. They were the Colombo power trying to facilitate. I go to 64 now, when Zhou Enlai visited Colombo again. And again, Mrs. Bandaranaike told him, can you do something that talk could start about the Western sector where there are some checkposts of China, and if they could be withdrawn, they will be happy. India will be able to talk. And when this was proposed, he said, yes, I am willing to do it, but we have to talk with India. India has to come and talk to us on the table, and we will work out. We will withdraw these posts, but we'll have to work out overall arrangement before we do that. And let India talk to us. India make proposal, but Nehru will not make the proposal. He said, unless China accept everything in toto, I will not do or talk anything. And again, all the time, he was adamant on one thing only.
Yeah, which is what eventually ends up happening, and that ends up leading to the relationship getting frozen in some way for many, many years before things begin to thaw again. Mr. Bhasin, thank you so much for this conversation. Once again, I reiterate, this is a fascinating book to which a 30-minute conversation can do very little justice. I recommend that everybody read it. There's tremendous detail in there that is of hugely important historical significance. Mr. Bhasin, again, thank you so much for this book.
Well, thank you, Mr. Manoj. I am sorry there was some problem in our conversation, but I think on the whole, I was able to answer your question rightly or wrongly, I don't know.
No, I think this was fascinating. Thank you so much.
Well, we are welcome.
If you liked our show,
Don't forget to check out other interesting podcasts on the IVM network. You can tune into them on the IVM Podcast app, ivmpodcast.com, or wherever you listen to your podcasts. You can also follow IVM on social media. The handle is @IVM Podcasts on Twitter, Facebook, and Instagram. And hey, if you'd like to dive into Takshashila's research on technology, strategy, and economic affairs, check us out at our Twitter handle @TakshashilaINST or our website takshashila.org.in.
I hope you enjoyed that show. If you aren't following us on social media, please do. We're IVM Podcasts on Twitter, Facebook, and Instagram. We'd like to thank the sponsors on the network this week, Cred, PayPal, and Siad. Thank you. We really do appreciate the support. So this week on Cyrus Says was great. We had Meghna joining us on Cock and Bull, Tanveer Taj and Priyanka Jena talking about pets. Huma Qureshi talks about her new television show and her life in Bollywood. And to celebrate 700 episodes on Cyrus Says, we had a number of his previous producers come on board and reminisce. Tune into This Round Is On Me, where Gauri Devidayal was joined by Samir Sheth and Yash Panage. These are the guys who started Bombay Canteen, O Pedro, and a number of other restaurants. Really great conversations they had with Gauri. On The Habit Coach, Ashton Doctor tells us about nourishing creativity and the importance of losing and some micro-habits to counter overthinking. On their 75th episode, Ritasha and Rayushi talk to Naveen Richards. On The Note with Monica Nayad, she speaks with Komal Nahata to talk about the business of Bollywood, lockdown losses, piracy issues, and experiments being done to keep it going. On Advertising is Dead, Varun is joined by Guru Bhatt, VP of Customer Success Platform for PayPal India, to talk about how the digital money landscape and the fintech ecosystem has fundamentally altered the world. We also have Thalarate, our Kannada podcast. Hosts Ganesh and Pawan discuss video games, and Sivakamyam Sabatam, the Tamil show where Kavita Jiva sheds light in another story about the bravery and excellence in the governance of the Pallava dynasty. And with that, I hope to see you again next week.
Namaskar, dear friends. My name is Ashish Vidyarthi. Life, as you know, is a journey. And you and I, travelers, how can we celebrate this travel? I have a podcast for you, Begin the Journey. I share stories and moments from my life. Do tune in every Monday and Thursday to listen to my podcast on the IVM Podcast website, app, or wherever you get your podcast from. Cheers.